Welcome to China Tech Talk, a weekly discussion of technology and startups here in China. I am John Artman, editor-in-chief of TechNode, and as always, I'm joined by Matthew Brennan, founder of China Channel. So this week we talk with Kaiser Kuo, and if you've never heard of Kaiser, I would be very surprised. He is literally a rock star in the China culture and technology area. He used to work for Baidu, but before that, he was coming back and forth, actually doing rock and roll. And since then, he has done many things, including, of course, the Sinica podcast. And so this week we talk with him about a lot of different things. But some of the most interesting sections of the conversation were about Baidu, and in part about his time there. And I think one of the big things that I learned from the conversation was that from the outside, it seems like Baidu, maybe number one, isn't doing so well. Number two, they've made quite a few mistakes that have kind of gotten them into the position they are in now. But the way Kaiser describes it, it seems that number one, these were reasonable mistakes to make, and that these are mistakes that Baidu can easily recover from.
Yeah, I mean, he's got a unique and insider viewpoint on everything that's been going on around Baidu. He's left them now, but it was last year, and he was with them for many years. Head of director of international communications, so he had high level access to top level management, and obviously Kaiser speaks perfect Chinese, and he's been in the IT game in China for. It's from way back into sort of, from the beginning, pretty much, from doing startup in this area at the same time as Jack Ma was getting going in Hangzhou. So, yeah, a wealth of experience. He's a real storyteller. He's already got some fascinating insights and I think we don't really need to introduce him too much. As you said, John, I assume most of our listeners will know Kaiser.
Yeah, I think most of our listeners will know. So like I said, we talk about a lot of different stuff. We talk about Baidu. We talk about a little bit about the People's Daily. Matt and I, we spoke about Honor of Kings. And so Kaiser gives us a bit more context about, what a commentary from the People's Daily might actually mean. And whether or not it has any impact on Tencent's strategy or corporate policy. But then we also talk about some recent events, some other recent events as well, including Apple's position here in China, and also the all that stuff that's happening with VPNs. And so Kaiser gives us a bit more context on that. And I think that's really what I enjoyed most about this conversation was, talking with someone who has pretty much seen everything. He was here for, living in China for, about 20 years or so. And so just that wealth of information and that wealth of history that he was able to impart to us, I think, was just amazingly invaluable.
I totally agree. Let's get into it.
Well, Kaiser, thank you so much for taking the time to come on to the show today.
My pleasure, John. My pleasure, Matt.
So the first question that we like to ask all of our guests before we really jump into the topic is what's your China story? Tell us, how did you come to China, and what's your experience here?
Mine is mighty long of the telling. My first trip to China was back in 1981. I was a wee lad of 15. My folks had already been traveling back and forth to China a lot. They had left China during the revolution and gone to Taiwan, and then in the mid-1950s emigrated from there to the United States, where me and my slew of siblings, we were all born. But they were, sort of on the PRC side after the Nixon visit, and when the Chinese American community was sort of deeply divided. And my father had the opportunity to come to China as early as 1975. And so we were fed a pretty steady diet of commie propaganda. And, my father at least was disabused of his, belief that the Cultural Revolution was anything less than an abomination. once, he'd started going there fairly regularly. But by 81, he was ready to take the kids over. I went and I actually spent a summer living in like a second floor underground, urinal smelling kind of dorm basement at Peking Normal University, Capital Normal University, rather. I somehow, in spite of that, I wanted to come back, and in '86 we took another family trip. By then, the trajectory of China was pretty clear to me, and I figured I wanted to attach myself to that in some capacity.
And how old were you at that point?
I was in college now, and that sort of helped me nudge me toward changing my course of study. I stayed in political science, but I shifted my focus from the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe to China, where I already had sort of a leg up on the language. Russian was just too difficult. And so by '86, I was pretty sure that I wanted to do something related to China. And that opportunity came along in '87 when my band was invited to go to China. I was playing in a band in college at UC Berkeley. We were invited to go to China to play, which was something that really unusual at the time. It was just I think the only band that had gone there was Wham! UK. We weren't anything, we were playing in local, clubs and stuff. It was a vintage 70s progressive rock band with sprawling epic songs and the whole deal, the very, very proggy. But in spite of that, we were invited to go to China to play. It didn't end up happening, but I was sort of burning with this idea that I was going to go there and play rock. And so I did. As soon as I graduated in '88, and I just hightailed it over to China. And, I brought a guitar and brought some effects pedals and a little amp and quickly met up with a bunch of musicians. And so after that, it was really easy. It was kind of a no-brainer to keep, being attached to China because it was just so damn fun. So after a year there from '88 to '89, which ended with not so much fun in '89, I came back to the States and then plunged into graduate studies, during which, every summer I would ostensibly be going back to China to try to do research. But in fact, I was just going back to hang out with my rocker friends and play shows and, shoot videos and record stuff. And I was finally convinced, well, our bass player, the band I started was called Tang Dynasty, and it went on to some fame and notoriety while I was gone, mostly in my absence, so I had very little to do with its success. But when I came back in '96, it was because our bass player, Zhang Ju, had been killed in a car accident. He was riding his motorcycle and got killed. And he was sort of the to use a Spinal Tap reference, he was the Derek Smalls of the band in that he was able to keep the personalities of our own David St. Hubbins and our own Nigel Tufnell from killing each other. So the lead singer, Ding Wu, and the lead guitarist who had replaced me, Lao Wu, they didn't like each other so much, and after he was gone, the band was on the verge of breakup. So they asked me to come back to the band to see if I could help repair things. So yeah, from there it was pretty easy. Just the really quick version of it is I played in the band from '96 to '99. I left the band in '99 for reasons that are very, very complicated, but fortunately the internet was there. I mean, there were all these people, all this VC money sloshing around. Everyone was starting a company, and so the night that I left the band, I just sort of sat up by myself, just opened up a Word doc and started typing out my inventory, what I thought I could do at this point. Go back, finish my degree, or should I just start another band, or do something else? And so the do something else was the only thing that was there as a catch basin for people like me with no real talents was the internet. I figured, hell, I can string a sentence together. I know a lot of people in the entertainment world now, and I taught myself a little HTML and putting together the band's webpage, so maybe I could work in an internet company. And lo and behold, the very next day, I basically had landed a job at a new startup called ChinaNow.com. And from there, having been in editorial and working early, in the early internet, I had, Jack Ma and speed dial, so I could get a job like yours, doing tech reporting. There weren't quite as many opportunities back then, but there weren't quite as many people trying to do it either. So I managed to kind of recreate myself as a technology reporter. And then from there, of course, as you'll find out soon enough, as soon as you kind of have a name as a technology reporter, the companies will come after you to, lure you to the dark side, right?
So
and there I went.
So yeah, before we kind of jump into your career as a communications director,
in the dark side.
So that was, so you were here for what, like more than 20 years then?
Yeah, more than 20 years.
And how much of that was corporate, kind of working communications and specifically for Baidu?
Well, Baidu 6 years, so that was from June of 2010 until just last year. Before that, I was at Youku doing a similar job for a couple of years. Before that, I kind of went off track for a little while. I did spend a little time at Ogilvy in an ill-fitting job for me. It was ostensibly director of digital strategy. I don't know. I didn't really do any digital strategy, and they didn't really know quite what to do with me. That didn't work out so well. Anyway, during that time, I did, though, write a blog on what was happening in digital, and it was a really important time. It was around the time that the iPhone came out, so there was a lot to write about.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking back to when you were at Youku and Baidu, just how different things are. So I've been in and out of technology and media since I've been in China, and my last stint out was for about a year and a half. And by the time I came back, you were gone. Jeremy Goldkorn was gone as well, and it just feels like the atmosphere in terms of media, in terms of coverage and communication in general, it's just a very, very different landscape these days.
I take that as a compliment. No, it is very different. I mean, I think no, there was no great plan in all of us. Bill Bishop, me, Jeremy, and a bunch of other people, all leaving within a year or so of one another. I think a lot of it had to do with just we all had kids. Our kids were of a certain age. It was sort of time to give them the American leg of their education. That was the primary reason that all of us left. And I think, there are tons of really super talented people who continue to go to China, I mean, who have been there for a long time. People do talk about the changed landscape, and I guess I find that, it was nice that we made any kind of an impact at all. But I think it's as strong as ever.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, especially in the weather in Beijing for kids is
that's right. The god awful pollution.
Yeah. So how about we talk a little bit about your time working at Baidu? Because
Sure.
Kaiser, that's where you spent. That was your longest stint, right? And it's a company that obviously everyone listening to the podcast will know about. If you could tell us how you landed a job at Baidu, how did you start working there, and how was it? Was it what you imagined before you joined, and actually when you were working in the company?
Yeah, I think that Baidu. I mean, I certainly was among the many people who had a lot of misgivings about the company. I think a lot of it had to do with events of early 2010, and notably, Google's pullout from China. There's a kind of psychological habit of mind that we have, whereby when you have a narrative that casts one character as such an obvious protagonist in the story. I mean, in January of 2010, when Google, sort of dramatically announced that they weren't going to censor anymore, even if that meant they'd have to pull out of China. I think there were a lot of people who imagined Sergey and Larry and maybe Eric, standing arm in arm in front of a column of tanks in Tiananmen. And, so the white hat clearly went on Google's head. And so who are you going to put the black hat on, right? There was, obviously there were a lot of people who were, huge Google supporters. I was certainly among them. I thought that Google was an excellent product. I think There were a lot of people who, but I think in a sober moment when you think about it, I don't think the narrative was exactly fair. There was never any evidence that, and there just simply wasn't true that Baidu had anything at all to do with Google's decision to decamp from China. They were certainly the beneficiary of it, but there was nothing sinister going on. Baidu had suffered pretty badly in 2008 because of the Sanlu milk scandal. This belief that they had, on behest of these for sort of commercial reasons, had deleted any negative results that you came up with. I think that after having spent some time there, I realized that when they delete stuff like that, it's never for commercial reasons. It's because the fucking government made them do that, right? This was the Olympic year. It was sort of taking some of the shine off of Beijing, because of this horrible milk scandal where all these kids had died or become horribly deformed. My sense was that my being approached by Baidu had a lot to do with the Google exit. So they had actually swung around a couple of times before, just through headhunters, but this time they made a serious, more serious approach, and I decided to see what was up and go through the round of interviews. I really, had written out a pretty thorough diagnosis of what I thought was wrong with Baidu from a communication standpoint, and what I would try to implement. And I think that stood me in good stead during that round of interviews. I was really impressed with the people that I met all the way. I mean, I had known Robin before. I'd known a couple of other people at Baidu just from, interviewing them as a reporter, but being able to ask them really candid questions and have them just give really candid answers gave me a lot of confidence. It was by no means an absolutely perfect job. There, like all jobs, there were a lot of things. I mean, people would do just insanely boneheaded things that I would have to wipe up afterward. I mean, that's your job as a communications person. But for the most part, I think that company, had its moral bearings, at least at the leadership level. There were always going to be bad apples, but at the leadership level, I thought that they were noble of purpose, and their politics aligned more or less with mine. So I found that they were much more Western. I don't mean to suggest that anything non-Western isn't good, but look, I don't know if you guys feel the same way, but I'm a guileless, dumb American, who's not really capable of being cunning and deceitful. I don't thrive in any kind of a Chinese corporate environment that isn't either A, a media company where you're supposed to be just sort of a straight shooter, or B, an internet company where, the culture is derived explicitly from Silicon Valley, and they kind of like you to be really candid to the point of tactlessness.
So is that how you would describe the corporate culture, Kaiser, there? It's candid and open and...
Yeah, that's not just how I would describe it, it's how they describe it too. The culture was, and they sort of winnowed it down to a very nice little slogan, which was just, in English, simplicity and reliability. So the 简单可依赖. So simplicity, really what it meant was that kind of candor that I was talking about. So it was a basically meritocratic company, not very hierarchical, or at least they tried very hard not to be. You, for example, were not allowed to use any honorific titles for other people. Nobody was, Li Zong or Guo Zong or Wang Zong. It was all just first names or nicknames or, whatever people called themselves. And you were encouraged to be, to stand your ground on a good idea, and to be, stubborn to the point of insubordinate. And the culture, they sort of taught it to you with a bunch of what they called analects, the writings that they gave you at the beginning that everyone was obliged to read. Really interesting, because it's just story after story drawn from the history of the company, of employees who basically defy their managers, quite high up into the chain, and prevail. Their idea turns out to be, a multi-million-dollar idea. It turns out they had the better idea. So I like that about the company, that there was this sort of, really Silicon Valley-esque ethos to it.
Well, as you mentioned, there were as you described it, some bad apples, and people did do some boneheaded things that you had to clean up. But I mean, that's the interesting thing about Baidu, I think, in part because it is a search business that is run, a lot of its revenue is going to come from advertisements. A lot of the problems it's had is exactly because of those advertisements. So, for example,
Sure.
like the Sanlu, more recently with advertisements for hospitals and things like that. And it's even been, some people have even described Baidu less as a technology company and more of a sales company. I mean, would you agree with that? And would you maybe attribute some of those boneheaded things due to that?
I would not say that it is, more of a sales company than a technology company. I think it's a technology company that, where the sales is often done, kind of ineptly. The technology is great. If you know anything about the company, it's sort of by and for the engineer. It's a very, very tech-driven company. Sales, they have wrestled with a lot of different issues, and a lot of it is related to pharmaceuticals and to medical. This is an area that I think is, wisely been foreclosed to Google for a very long time. It's a fraught, difficult area, but it's one where I think Baidu made the bet that they could do it if they were really, really vigilant. They could do it right. I think in the most recent case, with this cancer treatment at a Wuxing hospital that ended in the unfortunate death of this young man, as in all other cases, they really make the advertiser jump through the hoops. They make them show all the proper documentation, show that they are duly licensed to offer whatever therapy it is that they are offering. And, they can't be absolutely perfect. And unfortunately, the stakes of imperfection are very high in the case of medical technologies. But in this case, to me, it was obvious that the anger that was directed at Baidu was all out of proportion to Baidu's crime. That where anger really ought to have been, and I think was more naturally directed, was toward the totally fucked up Chinese healthcare system, was toward the sort of the venality that pervades society. But the government realized this as well and decided, let's just throw Baidu under the bus and direct the ire of the people toward that company. And so they went out of their way to lambaste Baidu on different state-owned media. And this is not the first time that sort of thing has happened either.
We're going to come on to a similar topic with Tencent later on, I think. Of getting criticized by the government and how that works in China. So you were at Baidu for a long time, kind of like
6 years.
6 years, and
not that long.
in China time that's a long time, and in China
Sure.
internet time that's an incredibly long time. And if you could just pick out some of the more interesting changes that you've seen over those 6 years at Baidu. I'm sure there were many, but a couple that really stuck in your mind.
Yeah, I think landing there right away, you had to hit the ground running. There was so much to be done. Well, first of all, in managing the whole Google narrative, I think I did a pretty good job on that, really understanding how to talk about internet censorship and how to talk about all these other things, and to explain Baidu's perspective on things, because I think it's very different than what was popularly imagined. Baidu wasn't the a willing participant in censorship. They fought it as best they could and made compromises that I think were sensible and ethical. The rest of it, I think that it was relatively easy in my first couple of years because of Google's exit. There was a period of kind of complacency, I think, that everyone would identify, that began shortly after the Google exit and went all the way up until really the summer of 2012, where I think Baidu made some mistakes. I think that in terms of its culture, it didn't have the same sort of ruthlessness and hunger, which is good, but you pay a price for that. And probably most importantly, they were not quick out the gate on the mobile revolution. They didn't have a strong smartphone offering when they should have. I mean, they were late. There's no question that they didn't realize its enormousness until they were going to suffer some competitional disadvantage from it. So I think, summer of 2012 was probably the most dramatic. So if you'll think back to that time, I mean, the rise of by then it was clear that, our anxiety over having been laid out the gate was obvious. But we also faced this sudden upstart challenge from Qihoo, from 360, which had launched its own quote unquote search product. It had already dominated, grabbed a big portion of the browser market. We knew where that was going. I think there were some people who sort of knew what might come of it inevitably, but then they suddenly, launched search, and it was quite a moment of panic for the company.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because you mentioned mobile, and certainly Baidu isn't the only company that got caught flat-footed. Facebook, I think, is one that comes very easy to mind.
Absolutely, yeah.
But I remember actually because I actually interviewed you about this when you were working in Baidu about I think at the time you didn't call it an Android fork, but it was basically Android-based operating system created by Baidu, but that doesn't seem to have actually gone anywhere.
Yeah, there are plenty of people who did the same thing, and they didn't go anywhere either. Where's Ali with theirs? Where's Tencent with theirs? Right. I mean, it turns out that plain vanilla Android was pretty much good enough for most people, right?
I mean, Baidu's filled with highly intelligent, very very techie people, as you say. I'm sure they saw the mobile revolution coming.
I think what they didn't understand was how fundamentally different the experience would be, how they would really need to retool. I mean, I think there were a lot of people, even people in the very senior leadership, who fundamentally believed that the product didn't need to change that much to port to a new platform. I think they hadn't really internalized just how different the whole user experience would be doing search. I think they hadn't really thought about the difference in use cases. I think they can certainly be faulted for that, but that was the blind spot.
Yeah, and so Kaiser, you mentioned 360 coming out with their own search product, and kind of changing gears a little bit. Qihoo 360 is one of those companies that has become notorious for their willingness, and in fact, it seems to be part of their publicity strategy is to just pick a lot of fights. And to be very, very public about
to be evil, yeah.
Exactly, and to be very public with those. And so it's really interesting now because you look at like companies like Mobike and Ofo, who are the two biggest competitors when it comes to the bike rental industry right now. But on the surface, at least publicly, the competition is fairly tame. And so I'm kind of curious, looking back at your time here in China, in your role as Baidu or in previous positions or just as a tech reporter, what are some of the wilder examples of just kind of Chinese tech companies taking their grievances public? Because right now it just feels very, very tame compared to what I saw in the past.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with your characterization of that. I think during the time that I was at Baidu, it was all-out warfare. I mean, everyone trying to undermine everyone else, to plant negative stories about the other companies. I don't really. We were completely separate. I worked international communications, was under investor relations, so we didn't really always know what domestic PR was up to. But everyone had their bag of dirty tricks. There was a lot of deliberate depositioning of other people. So that's just on the PR front. I mean, just on business strategy as well. I mean, I think nobody stooped quite as low as Qihoo 360 did. They were really. I mean, they were and oddly, I think they were admired by some people in this fucked up, completely amoral culture that we live in, where anti-heroes are venerated. I mean, they were really the villain on the scene. As far as I was concerned, they did some pretty horrible things from the time that Zhou Hongyi exited from Yahoo. I mean, it was, they had this product. I think this is probably the most interesting. I think if you follow the whole story of Zhou Hongyi and 360, there you will find just some real scummy and villainous behavior. What he did, I think this is a great story. I think this is just, everyone should know about this. So he had this tool called 3721 Senxi Yao. It was extremely popular. What it did was it was a browser toolbar that would resolve Chinese language input. For example, not everyone knew that NetEase was 163, but they all knew that it was called Wang Yi. So you could type in Wang Yi and it would resolve to 163.com. You could type in Xinlang and it would resolve to Sina.com.cn. I mean, those are just more obvious examples. You could type in really the Chinese names of any internet property and it would resolve to the correct URL. Because not everyone could remember these URLs. Often they weren't written in standard pinyin, and sometimes they were just difficult to remember. So it became a very, very widespread and useful product, and it would install itself rather stubbornly. And sometimes when you weren't looking, you'd land on a web page, and it would automatically install this browser toolbar. Well, everyone all started getting in on the action. There were a lot of other companies that launched these things, and they all went for this kind of stubborn, like aggressive install and stubborn resistance to being uninstalled through normal methods. But Zhou Hongyi, he was the worst. So he sold that company, 3721, to Yahoo. They acquired the company, and then he joined as general manager. When the writing was on the wall, it was clear that he was falling out with them. He started developing Qihoo on the side, and the first thing that he did out the gate, as soon as he left, he took 104 engineers with him when he left. But then, as soon as he left, he launched this product along with Kaspersky, which was purpose built to uninstall Senxi Yao, the very product he had sold to Yahoo. I mean, that was what it was for. It would identify it as malware and uninstall it. And I thought it was kind of, hats off. That's like truly like evil and warped. And that was not the only thing that he did. I mean, he's done many, many other things, but I think I might, be subject to legal action if I spill too much of this.
Well, yeah, because also, but one of the things that comes to mind is the 360 10-cent war. Very, very similar because Qihoo, one of their biggest products was this desktop antivirus tool. And at one point they got into this huge war of words between Tencent and 360 because Qihoo identified QQ as malware, and there was this
the same MO.
Exactly. But what was going on behind that? I mean, was there something else besides or was it just Tencent and QQ just kind of stubbed each other's toes?
Well, you watch American electoral politics and during the Republican primary, it's always you get the most press if you go after the biggest target, right? If you're a little guy and you decide you want to pick a fight with somebody, you don't pick a fight with another little guy. I mean, you got to walk up to the biggest bully on campus and just pop in the, and that's what he did. Tencent at that time was already clearly emerging as the big one of BAT, right? So they went after them. They knew that there was a lot of stuff that they could say that would resonate with Chinese internet users. Tencent itself is not as pure as the driven snow. There are a lot of things that they've done in terms of their really aggressive user acquisition. In terms of, there were a lot of things about QQ that legit could have been called sort of malware-ish, right? I don't think that it was all spelled out in the end user license agreement either, the terms of service. I think they weren't the only company that did things like that. So that was their strategy. They did the same thing. The first fight they actually picked was with Alibaba. They right out the gate, because Alibaba. Like I said, they launched this product that uninstalled Qihoo, that uninstalled 3721 Yahoo had acquired that, and of course Yahoo was now under the stewardship of Jack Ma, and then they basically went to war. I mean, they went to war really, really badly. You know, at one point, they were not, you know, buying each other's advertising. They were not working together in any way. There's a lot of, you know, public vilification, mutual recrimination, and stuff. So that was the first. I mean, then they went to war with Tencent, and then finally in 2012 they went to war with Baidu. That was all sort of. I mean, and yeah, everyone knew their name, right?
Yeah, exactly. But as you say, I mean, like it seems like they have just made themselves into a notorious brand rather than something that that people are necessarily willing to trust. I mean, it feels like whenever I see Qihoo in the news, which to be honest these days I don't see very often.
Right. They've faded.
Yeah, exactly. They're much more low key now. You know, it's just like, oh my gosh, here they go again. And so to some degree, you know, it seems like their strategy might have just kind of worn itself out. But
that'd be good.
Finally, right?
Yeah, the Tencent 360 thing, I think, was pretty crazy. I mean, like, it affected pretty much every desktop user in the country. Suddenly was left with this message on their screen when they tried to log into QQ saying, you know, it's us or them, and so that's why it's kind of like the classic. I can't think of a better case study of how the Chinese internet, you know, back in the day was just a very different place from what non-Chinese users would. I mean, if anything like that happened, you know, in the States or something, it would just be mind-blowing for something like that. So to just, you know,
there was a precedent for that in the era of 3721 and its multiple competitors, including one that was actually put out by CNNIC. The China Network Information Center, or whatever it's called. You know, the people who put out the report, they actually had one of these products as well, and it was also kind of, you know, evil. In this time, a lot of people's computers just stopped working because they were all basically built to uninstall the other and install themselves in a way that was very, very hard to get rid of. And a lot of, you know, people's computers were just simply freezing up. It was a terrible time.
It's horrible for the user. But it seems that now it's actually like, you know, you look at Alibaba and Tencent, and so obviously there still is that tension between the two companies, but the tension is more on like a strategic level, it seems, and they don't really take things
the land
publicly.
grab, right.
Exactly. So, you know, with we
I mean, it's a lot of proxy wars. Most of the time, when you look at major areas, I mean, whether it was back in the 020 wars or in the rideshare, they were aligned, but in the bikes now, there's usually one company behind one and another behind one of the rivals. And so, so proxy wars. And I think part of it is that their territories have sort of congealed, right? They kind of know where the borders are, and there are still skirmishes, but it's not an existential war of you know, total war at this point.
It's more like two internets on the phone.
Yeah, I think you might think of it that way. And those two companies so utterly dominate the scene. It's really remarkable.
Yeah. So you're back in the States now, Kaiser. Like,
I am. Yes,
you are, and you know, you're still very much a figurehead for China technology in the States. I imagine you're going around, you're talking to a lot of people about it, doing you do public speaking, I guess, and things around the States. What are you sensing from the perception of people about Chinese technology?
I think the narrative has so completely shifted. I mean, if you think back just to the spring of 2015, it was, you know, the campaign season. Joe Biden, the former VP, was going around making speeches at graduations talking about how China was incapable of innovation, and it was patting the U.S. on the back because having a more or less free internet guaranteed somehow that we were going to continue to dominate in innovation. By the end of the year, really, by the end of 2015, or certainly into 2016, you saw a completely different angle. I mean, people had recognized by that point that Chinese companies not only were quite capable of innovation, but that they had some really amazing products. I mean, this was happening not only in hardware. I think people were really waking up to just how many blades that Swiss Army knife of Tencent's WeChat actually had in it. They were seeing bike sharing happen in 2017, late 2016, early 2017, and realizing, look, God, I mean, I don't know how many times I was interviewed about this shifting narrative, but it was pretty clear that at least Western reporters writing about China had all decided that the whole China is only capable of imitation, not of innovation. That narrative was passé, right? So that's the biggest thing. And obviously, there's a reason for that. I mean, I wish it had happened a few years previous. I think it probably deserved to be written beginning in maybe 2012 or 13. But clearly, to me, there was really good reason. You couldn't, any fair observer couldn't look at the technology ecosystems of the two countries and not see that China had really developed something that was worthy of singling out for innovative praiseworthiness. Oh God, that was so badly said.
Very, very, very corporate, though. So I mean, but it's interesting because I mean, China has this environment where all these innovative products are coming out. But the next big question is, can they make it global? You look at WeChat and Tencent. They have not. Number one, they haven't done much work to make it into a global product. And the next question is, can they? They're
right.
A very domestically focused company. A lot of their international forays are through other companies that they've acquired. And so I'm curious. I mean, do you think that there are innovations or products that are gaining momentum here in China that are a bit more exportable?
Well, I think the hardware, there's no question that it is. I mean, obviously, China's got so much going on in drones and so much going on in IoT. That let's leave that aside and look at just sort of consumer internet products. And then I have to conclude that the Chinese companies really don't have the capacity to do that right now, and probably shouldn't. So let me suggest. I mean, I'm going to borrow an idea that I think I first talked about with Clay Shirky, that maybe the very things that make Chinese internet companies so successful in China. Let's look at Tencent. Just the tight integration with financial services here. With the banks, with a huge bunch of services that are available online or offline, for that matter. Those very things. Its familiarity with the regulatory environment, its willingness. Those are the very things that would hobble it were it to try to expand internationally. It just doesn't have that. It's the same for Alibaba as well. It has fit itself to Chinese realities so very well that when you move it to another environment, it just doesn't have those skills. So if you'll indulge me for a second, somehow one day I just kind of came up with this, and it just makes a lot of sense to me. You got to think of these Chinese internet companies as let's call it generic company, Chinese company is a band of Ice Age hunters. They're very good at bringing down woolly mammoths. They know exactly how they spook from fire or noise. They know how to stampede them off cliff sides. They know where to stab them with spears to kill them quickly. They know how to avoid being trampled. They know what cuts of meat are tastiest and which ones preserve well. They really know everything there is to know about hunting, killing, and using these woolly mammoths. There's still, at this point, a lot of woolly mammoths out there, and it seems to me that they should be focused on stripping and preserving all that meat, bringing down more woolly mammoths, and fighting off the carrion fowl and the hyenas or whatever, the scavengers, rather than doing what this one guy in the tribe stands up and he looks across the tundra, and he sees a herd of caribou over there. And he says, "Look, them caribou look tasty," but they don't know how to hunt them. They don't know anything about them. They don't know. I mean, would it be a wise decision to abandon all this woolly mammoth flesh lying, rotting on the ground to chase the caribous? Probably not. I think that crossing the Bering Strait after the caribou would not be smart.
Well, what about the opposite? So what about the tribes on the other side hunting the caribou, now looking at China's woolly mammoths? I remember when I first encountered you was when Groupon was coming into China, and I think you famously said that I can't remember the exact quote, but basically,
let's not try to reconstruct that exact quote. I think I remember it.
Yeah, but it basically the gist of it was that they're not doing very well, and they really don't know what they're doing.
Right, and they didn't do very well, did they?
They did not. They did not.
So it's thank you, first of all, for indulging me with that metaphor and for carrying it on and not talking about caribou hunters looking at woolly mammoths.
Yeah,
I think it doesn't really work anymore because the woolly mammoths, for one thing, aren't behind a protective wall, which is sort of a permeable membrane only in one direction, right? I mean, Chinese companies aren't really prevented from trying, at least, to compete in the U.S., where right now, so I don't think this is true if you go back to 2007, 2008, but now they'd face incredible difficulties. Not only do we have the new cybersecurity law and a slew of other laws that would require them to do things that I think a lot of internet companies would be very uncomfortable doing, but also just the simple fact of censorship. I think that just runs so against the principles of so many of these internet companies. So different story. It's not for lack of, well, there are plenty of reasons why American internet companies, even were they not faced with those sorts of regulatory strictures, would still fail. I think it would be, look, I mean, Facebook is talking about coming into China, but does anyone really think that they're going to eat significantly into the numbers of either Weibo or Weixin? I don't think so.
Not at all. But I guess, the question that I wanted to ask would be because Apple, if you asked me 2 years ago, is there one company that can kind of buck this trend of companies coming into China, tech companies coming into China and failing? I thought it would be Apple, but it seems that their market share just keeps dropping year after year. So what's your take?
Well, I mean, it's still significant, right? I wouldn't write it off. I mean, if you look at the percentage of Apple's global revenues that are coming from China, it's still enormous. I think Apple has still managed to do very well. It's still a prestige brand there. I mean, it's still ubiquitous. Especially in the metropolitan areas, people use iPhone 7s, or iPhone 6 Pluses. I mean, they're still doing fine. Their market share is of course it's falling. I mean, there are so many excellent Android-based handsets from all of these companies that you'd not heard of just a few years ago. I mean, Xiaomi's maybe only one of many. Oppo, Vivo, all these other companies with fine handsets, and of course there's Huawei. I think that I wouldn't write them off. I think that they've still got a lot of juice in China. I thought we were going to talk about their decision to host data in their new data center in Guizhou, but maybe we can also talk about that.
Yeah, definitely, and also, of course, their recent removal of VPNs from the China.
Right.
So that's what I was going to ask next, actually. And so what do you make of this? And so everything the past couple of months, there's new stories. There's lots of different stories about how the government is moving against VPNs, and now Apple has removed all of these VPN apps from the App Store. So I mean, all three of us, we've seen controversy. We've seen feathers ruffled whenever something happens with VPNs. Everyone kind of goes a bit crazy for a while, and then it dies down. I mean, are we seeing something similar again? Is it another storm in the teacup, or do you think it's something bigger than that?
Hard to say. It's certainly, look, the 19th Party Congress is coming up. There's obviously a lot of skittishness. I mean, more than usual. And China's in a position where it can. I mean, it's got a whole lot more. Well, not just more at stake, but also just sort of more muscle. Unfortunately, I think this time it might be more serious. I don't know that they're going to foreclose every way for people to hop the wall. It will still continue to happen. I think it's not ever going to be a 100% shut, but that's not the intention. Probably the intention is to just keep that number of VPN users below whatever threshold it is where they think that there's a possibility of sort of a broader infection. This has always been the policy, and they tweak it just based on how sensitive things are politically at home. They tweak it according to how many people they think are actually using it, but it's never been a huge number. I think it probably has never been over 2 or 3% of the population, of the internet population, that uses any kind of circumvention technology at all. I think that it's for the people who do use it. They are a very important piece of the internet using demographic, but they're also a piece that is worrisome to Beijing for obvious reasons. Because they are people who do have a lot of connections outside of China and are really interested in what's going on outside of China. There's reason to believe that they might be a conduit for for dissent, right? For the spread of dissenting ideas. I think that what companies like Apple have done here with all these companies, they need to make a very simple. Well, it's not a simple calculation at all. I mean, it seems superficially simple, but it's how much good can you do? How big of a compromise do you need to make? And how much commercial success do you actually stand to enjoy? I mean, so you have your conscience to have a dialogue with, and then you also have your shareholders, your stakeholders to dialogue with. And in Apple's case, the commercial is the commercial element of that is huge, right? They are so dependent on selling phones in China. They can't. They're not in a position where they would be able to easily say, well, no, fuck you, I'm not going to. I mean, it's not like San Bernardino where they're just going to be able to stand fast and say, we're not turning over source code. They are going to store user data where it's accessible to Chinese law enforcement on data centers in China in accordance with this new cybersecurity law. I mean, that was inevitable. They are going to take VPNs off of their app store in accordance with Chinese dictates. I mean, unfortunately, I think there's very little wiggle room for them there. You look at a company like Facebook, which is weighing going in, the calculus is very different. They don't stand to do much good. They don't stand to enjoy much by way of commercial success there. And the compromise they would have to make is enormous. So I think that, for me, I know how I would decide in both of these cases.
Yeah, I think it was just inevitable that something like this was going to happen with taking all these VPNs off the App Store. I was personally surprised it hasn't happened. It took so long to happen. And as you've alluded to about Baidu, this censorship, I think even the Chinese companies as well also don't like a lot of the rules that they have to
of course not
have to deal with. So I think let's not make the mistake that this is just against foreign companies. I think I've heard the same thing from Tencent people, that a lot of the stuff that happens on WeChat and other platforms is not them. They can't. It's done directly through by the government, and they don't like it, but they have to deal with it.
Right, of course. These are all consumer-facing internet companies, and none of them are so foolish as to think that the consumer prefers censored results or censored anything, right?
Yeah, it's difficult to say. I agree with you about Apple. I think that they're not doomed. Then it's not. We're not going to write them off in China, but it's certainly clear being on the ground, seeing like how people. There has been a shift in the consumer mindset, I think, about Apple. Whereas so much of Apple is about their brand, right? So much is about the halo effect, and I've just been seeing, that change a bit on the ground, where people who were religious Apple, iPhone users, especially men in particular, not less women, but switching and the local competitors really have caught up with some very, very decent phones.
Absolutely.
So it's not so much about just being a foreign brand or a local brand. It's more just there's a level playing field now. I think with just the handsets, whereas before Apple, especially when the whole mobile thing started out, and they pretty much invented this whole category. There was just such a huge spread between what they offered and what Android devices offer, whereas now that gap is very much closed, and the local competitors can actually offer in many ways phones that are more suited to the local. You can have dual SIM card, you can have app mirroring and stuff. You can have 2 WeChats on one phone. All the sort of like built-in filters for the cameras, so you take selfies and your skin looks a bit whiter and stuff without even using an app. All that kind of stuff is really what the consumers want here.
Yeah. As unfortunate as that may be.
But I wanted to bring the conversation back a little bit to some of the things that we were talking about before, and dealing a little bit with government relations and how these big companies deal with the government, whether it's censorship or something else. And Matt and I, we talked in a recent episode about Tencent's hit game Honor of Kings, also called sometimes Strike of Kings or Arena of Valor, I believe. Excuse me, Strike of Glory or Arena of Valor, which is
or any permutation thereof of strikes and glories and honors. And
yeah, they still haven't stuck with a specific English name yet. But one of the things that we did discuss was that there was a bit of I wouldn't call it a war of words, but there was a back and forth publicly between the People's Daily and Tencent, and it all began with a commentary in the People's Daily criticizing Honor of Kings for being poison, for creating this product that hooked people in particular children, and got them to spend inordinate amount of time playing this game. So I'm curious. I mean, like, looking back at your time here, and one of the great things about you and the podcast is how you guys really kind of deal with a lot of these types of issues. And so, I mean, is it normal for the People's Daily to criticize a large company like Tencent? And what do you think it means?
Well, it's really hard to say. The People's Daily is, yes, of course, an official organ. It does in many cases represent a state view, but there are also people who just sort of are op-ed writers who write without a whole ton of political supervision or a lot of so it's not a foregone conclusion that anything appearing in the pages of the People's Daily is going to represent a new policy direction or is meant to, but let's assume that it is. I can also understand that. I mean, I'm the father of an 11-year-old boy who, if I didn't control him, would spend every goddamn waking hour playing Minecraft. I mean, there's just no question. Or if not Minecraft, I mean, he would be Minecraft, or it would be Roblox, or something having to do with. I mean, he'd be on his computer all the damn time, and I kind of, I get that. I understand that China is still a really kind of heavily paternal kind of nanny state, and the Chinese government doesn't see it as odd or strange that it ought to take an interest in, how its children are spending their time. I mean, they force them to do all sorts of silly things. I don't know. I mean, I'm of two minds on this. I think that video games can be highly addictive. I don't know that it's. I think it first line of defense obviously is parenting, but I can sympathize with the people who sort of think the government might have a role to play in curbing these and imposing time limits, or they've tried to do this many times before, right? With different companies, with different gaming companies, just having these sort of auto timeouts, especially, I can't remember all the number of things that they've imposed to try to limit gameplay, but not unusual. Didn't even pop out to me. It was just sort of noise for me.
Okay, so probably nothing too much to worry about, but difficult to.
Well, I mean, if you're Tencent, obviously there is. If you're a Tencent shareholder, maybe there is. I don't really know the revenue contributions to that particular game, but I think from a social perspective, I don't think this is at all unusual.
Yeah, I guess they don't really break down the numbers game by game. So certainly they've had a big surge in the last quarter in gaming.
Yeah.
And
I honestly don't watch that segment very much at all.
Yeah, I mean, it's not. You're kind of either into gaming or you're not. For most people, we spoke about it a lot in the last podcast, didn't we, John?
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. I think it's because it's gone to mobile, right? I think that's the key. Is that gaming on the PC? Yes, I mean we touched upon it on last thing. The sort of net bar phenomenon that's been around for so many years in China, and that's very well documented that parents don't like that. There's been regulation against net bars many times, I think, but now it's on the phone, and now these games, the technology's there to make these games really good on the mobile phone, and that's kind of like what's changed with this one. I think is that. Honor of Kings.
I didn't even realize it was more than just a PC game.
It's a mobile only game. In fact, I think.
Okay. So yeah, shows you how much I watch games.
So I think we're almost towards the end, and so I wanted to bring the conversation full circle. At the beginning we were talking about your experience at Baidu and some of the changes that we've seen. And the thing is, what's interesting about Baidu is that it used to be BAT, so the big three of China. But over the last year or so, Baidu seems to have lost a bit of its standing, and now a lot of the news, a lot of the progress seems to be made by the AT, so Alibaba and Tencent. And so what I find to be quite interesting is Baidu trying to do O2O. And so, as you mentioned before, a lot of these companies, they end up doing kind of proxy battles or proxy wars by investing in other companies. Whereas Baidu, they just went whole hog and did their own YMI delivery company. And so I'm just curious. I mean, do you think that was a mistake? And why do you think that they decided to go down that hole?
I think that it was a reasonable decision at the time. I think that Baidu obviously had some real core competencies that would lend itself to doing that particularly well. It had a lot of experience working with small businesses. It had, the best mapping technology. It had really good AI-powered sort of multi-point to multi-point logistics systems. I think it would be able to do. I mean, there's no reason to think that it wouldn't be able to do a good job. Of course, that's not the only variable. The competition is really huge, and there's, it's how big your war chest is, how long you're willing to subsidize. But look, let's just make no mistake here. Baidu and the other O2O companies, Meituan and so forth, they've changed the behavior of the market. I mean, they've fundamentally altered it right now. I mean, the percentage of meals that are eaten at home, then delivered, the number of movie theater tickets that are bought online, the number of everything that everyone did O2O wise has profoundly changed consumer behavior. There's a market there where there wasn't one before. I don't think it's. I don't think that it was an entirely a mistake. I think that there was ferocious competition. I think that it didn't pay out, but I think also the market hasn't been patient for it. I don't know. I looked at Baidu's stock price as I do just every morning just to see, if I should be angry that I sold early. I'm angry that I sold early. No, it passed recently the point at which I sold, which was like in March of last year. I think I got out for like 192, but it was over $200 the other day. Right?
Yeah. Their Q2 report was really.
They
good.
had a killer second quarter. Back to basics. A lot of it is. This company is resilient. It'll weather this and many other storms. It may not, it may be pretty low in the rankings compared to Ali and Tencent right now, but I think that it's got some very, very strong people. It's got some tremendously good technologies. I think that it is a company that has always sort of invested for a further future. Robin is a real visionary. I think he has a view of how technology is going to evolve that I find very persuasive. That I think that deep learning is so profoundly transformative that autonomous driving is going to be so profoundly transformative, and I don't see the other companies as thick in the mix as Baidu is in any other of these areas.
Well, certainly, I mean, they are Tencent and Alibaba are working on in-house AI solutions and in machine learning, but Baidu is really the only company that they seem to really just be staking their future on artificial intelligence, which I think it makes a lot of sense. But the real question is, I mean, are they going to be able to create products out of that, and how? And what types of products? I mean, and will they be consumer facing? Will they be business facing? And so it's quite interesting.
Yeah, some of them will be invisible. I mean, I think already while I was still there, we were seeing significant bumps in click-through rates and in a lot of other I think important metrics that were attributable directly to use of deep learning technology in algorithmic ranking, in ranking of paid results. It was very, very obvious that AI was already profoundly impacting the core business. This isn't something that everyone is going to immediately notice. It's just like you wouldn't notice if Netflix suddenly got remarkably better, 10% better in their recommendation engine, right? But Netflix certainly would notice.
Yeah, definitely.
So yeah, that's the sort of thing that we're talking about. But there will be more. There will be, I think, transformative technologies like truly usable voice recognition, where just mumbling and speaking in really ordinary English to your device will become very commonplace because it'll be possible soon.
Yeah.
I mean, I already do it all the time when I'm driving, and I'm very frustrated. But with Baidu, it's actually quite good. I mean, I used it for maps constantly when I was living in China, and it was really quite good.
It's really interesting what Baidu's. A lot of people, the cynics, say that Baidu would say, okay, Baidu's doing this because they have to. They don't really have any choice, right? They've kind of lost mobile to Tencent and Alibaba. So what are they going to do? They have to put all their eggs in the AI basket. What would you say to someone who was taking that sort of cynical view?
Well, I would say that Baidu hasn't lost mobile. I mean, they're still doing extremely well in some of the functions like maps. I mean, they're still dominant in search. The percentage of searches that are originated from mobile continues to grow, and I think Baidu's doing a fine job in that area. Yeah, I think that it's certainly been a very challenging environment. They don't have an app comparable to WeChat, but nobody does. I mean, WeChat, that thing was just the source of so much just jealous fuming on my part. That's amazing, right? I mean, let's all.
Yes.
But I mean, obviously I haven't been in the company for a year, so I don't really follow the day-to-day very carefully, but I just don't think, I think anyone would be foolish to count them out. I think they're still a company that sits on a lot of cash that's still continuing to throw off really, really handsome revenues and very, very, solid profits. And they had a solid beat in Q2. They're looking pretty robust. I'm very happy what I'm doing now, and I wish them well. But I think many people have commented, I picked a pretty good time to leave. I left like a day or two before that whole cancer hospital scandal.
Yeah, right. Yes, you did. That was totally by coincidence.
Absolutely by coincidence. Yeah, planned long in advance. Mm-hmm.
So Kaiser, as a way to wrap up our conversation, we like to ask our guests, where can we find you if our listeners are interested in learning more about you and what you do? Where's the best place to find you?
Well, obviously, I mean, the Sinica podcast is what I do now. Sinica is powered by SupChina, so check out supchina.com. You can subscribe to the podcast. I think I do 2 podcasts. I do our regular hour-long conversation about current affairs in China. We've 350 episodes in or something. We've been doing it for 7 years. We're also we've launched something called the Caixin Sinica Business Brief, which is a weekly, which comes out on Mondays in the U.S., so generally late night Sunday night or early Monday morning in China. That's also subscribable on iTunes. Caixin Sinica Business Brief. I think the other stuff would be, SupChina's Facebook page, which I'm now in charge of, which is facebook.com/SupChina News, right? And then Twitter, SupChina News. And that's what I do full time now. It's the easiest place to find me. And, I'm always eager to hear from people. Kaiser at supchina.com. So, drop me a note.
Awesome. Well, Kaiser, thank you so much for being so generous with your time. We really appreciate it. It's been a great conversation.
My pleasure, John, Matt. Thanks so much, guys.